The blood on Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne's knuckles hadn't dried yet when the military tribunal delivered their verdict. 6 decorated officers stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, careers obliterated in a single morning. As she stood at attention in the sterile courtroom at Fort Ashworth, North Dakota, watching the last of them, Colonel Jackson Steele, hand over his insignia with trembling fingers, Aria could still taste copper in her mouth from where they'd split her lip 3 months ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The same lip that had whispered, "I can't breathe," through swollen tissue while she lay unconscious for 47 minutes in the mud behind the armory. The same mouth that would later speak the words that ended 6 military careers, "I remember everything." But this story doesn't begin with justice. It begins with betrayal. Aria Blackthorne stood 5 feet 4 inches in her combat boots, weighed 118 pounds soaking wet, and possessed the kind of quiet intensity that made seasoned soldiers step aside in hallways. At 24 years old, she was the youngest military police officer ever stationed at Fort Ashworth, a sprawling military installation nestled in the unforgiving plains of North Dakota where winter temperatures dropped to -40 and summer brought little mercy. She'd earned her place through excellence, not politics. Top of her class at the military police school, expert marksman, hand-to-hand combat instructor certification, and a mind sharp enough to cut glass. The daughter of a small-town mechanic from Oregon, Aria had joined the Army to prove that capability mattered more than connections, that merit could triumph over prejudice. She believed the uniform meant something. Honor, integrity, service before self. The naive idealism of a young woman who thought the military was different from the civilian world she'd left behind. Fort Ashworth had other ideas. The base housed the 47th Military Police Brigade, 1,200 soldiers responsible for law enforcement across 3 states. It was a prestigious assignment, the kind that launched careers toward Pentagon positions and general stars. The kind of place where old boy networks flourished and tradition meant more than regulation. Colonel Jackson Steele ran the 47th like his personal kingdom. 35 years of service, Silver Star recipient, the kind of officer who commanded respect through presence alone. At 6'2" with graying temples and steel blue eyes, he looked like Central Casting's idea of a military commander. His subordinates worshipped him. His superiors trusted him. His record was spotless. His methods were medieval. Steele believed women had no place in combat arms, no business carrying badges, no right to authority over men who'd bled for their stripes. He'd made accommodation for the new reality of integrated forces, but accommodation didn't mean acceptance. It meant finding creative ways to maintain the natural order. When Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne reported to Fort Ashworth on a crisp September morning, Steele saw a problem that needed solving. The first month passed without incident. Aria threw herself into the work with characteristic intensity. She studied base protocols until she could recite them from memory. She volunteered for extra duties, arrived early, stayed late, and never complained. Her fellow MPs respected her competence even if they questioned her presence. But competence made her dangerous. Excellence made her a threat. The campaign began subtly. Equipment malfunctions during training exercises. Radio failures during patrols. Assignment to the worst shifts, the most dangerous sectors, the jobs nobody wanted. Aria endured it all with stoic professionalism, thinking it was standard hazing, the price of proving herself in a male-dominated field. She was wrong. Major Raymond Cross, Steele's executive officer, orchestrated the psychological warfare with surgical precision. 20 years of military intelligence had taught him how to break people without leaving fingerprints. Cross understood that destroying someone required patience, methodology, and the appearance of plausible deniability. Captain Tyler Grimm, the training officer, made sure Aria's scores were questioned, her report scrutinized, her recommendations ignored. A former Special Forces officer with 2 combat deployments, Grimm viewed Aria's presence as an insult to every man who'd earned his place through blood and sacrifice. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane, the senior enlisted advisor, poisoned the NCO Corps against her with whispered conversations and subtle implications. A veteran of 3 wars with shrapnel scars covering his arms, Kane believed military service was a brotherhood that women could never truly understand. Sergeant First Class David Torres controlled logistics, making sure Aria's equipment was substandard, her supplies limited, her support minimal. He'd served under Steele for 8 years and would follow the colonel into hell if asked. Sergeant Paul Morrison handled communications, ensuring Aria's radio calls were delayed, her requests lost, her backup unavailable when she needed it most. He owed his career to Steele's mentorship and considered loyalty more important than justice. Together, they formed Steele's inner circle, 6 officers united by shared beliefs about military tradition and the proper place of women in combat. They'd served together for years, had each other's backs through deployments and investigations, and viewed themselves as guardians of institutional standards. Aria represented everything they feared: change, progress, the erosion of time-honored customs. She was competent enough to succeed, determined enough to persevere, and dangerous enough to inspire other women to follow her path. They decided she had to go. The plan crystallized during a late-night meeting in Steele's office, 6 men sharing bourbon and grievances, plotting the destruction of a young woman whose only crime was believing the Army's promises about equal opportunity. They would make her quit, transfer her out, or break her spirit so completely that she'd serve as a warning to others. But Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne had never quit anything in her life. She'd grown up poor in a town that expected little from the mechanic's daughter, had clawed her way through college on academic scholarships and weekend jobs, had endured the rigors of officer training when everyone said she was too small, too weak, too female to succeed. She'd overcome every obstacle through preparation, determination, and an unshakable belief that hard work would eventually triumph over prejudice. She thought Fort Ashworth would be no different. On November 15th, during a routine patrol of the base perimeter, 6 officers would teach her how wrong she was. They would show her that some battles couldn't be won through competence alone, that some enemies fought without honor, and that sometimes the uniform protected predators instead of prey. They would beat her unconscious behind the armory, leaving her for dead in the freezing North Dakota mud, confident that she would never dare speak of what happened, never risk her career by accusing respected officers of crimes they would deny. They underestimated her memory. They underestimated her courage. And most fatally, they underestimated her father's final lesson: sometimes, baby girl, the only way good people can fight back is by refusing to stay down. 3 months later, Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne would stand in a military courtroom and watch 6 careers end with the precision of a sniper's bullet. She would prove that justice delayed was not justice denied, that victims could become victors, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room carried the biggest truth. But first, she had to survive the night that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne's first real glimpse of Fort Ashworth's true nature came during her 3rd week at the base, wrapped in the deceptive pleasantness of a routine morning briefing. The military police station buzzed with its usual pre-shift energy. Officers checking equipment, reviewing reports, discussing the previous night's incidents over bitter coffee that had been brewing since 0500 hours. Aria sat in the 2nd row of folding metal chairs, notebook open, pen ready, the picture of professional attentiveness. She'd been assigned to the day's shift under Captain Tyler Grimm's supervision, a seemingly straightforward rotation that should have involved traffic enforcement, security checks, and routine patrols. Nothing complicated. Nothing that should have triggered the seismic shift that was about to fracture her world. The door to the briefing room opened with military precision. 6 pairs of boots struck linoleum in perfect synchronization as Colonel Jackson Steele entered, flanked by his inner circle like a general surveying conquered territory. Major Raymond Cross, his executive officer, carried a thick manila folder. Captain Grimm straightened automatically. The 3 senior NCOs, Staff Sergeant Kane, Sergeant First Class Torres, and Sergeant Morrison, formed a loose semicircle behind their commander. Aria noticed the formation immediately. Not random. Intentional. Territorial. "Good morning, soldiers," Steele's voice filled the room without effort. 35 years of command presence reduced 40 military police officers to respectful silence. "Before we begin standard briefings, I want to address some concerns that have come to my attention." He paused, gray eyes sweeping the assembled MPs like a searchlight probing for threats. When his gaze settled on Aria, something cold flickered behind the professional mask. Recent performance evaluations have highlighted some discrepancies in our unit's operational effectiveness, Steele continued. Equipment failures, communication breakdowns, response time delays. Issues that compromise mission readiness and put our soldiers at risk. Aria's pen stopped moving. Something about Steele's tone, the careful emphasis on certain words, the way his officers watched her rather than their commander, triggered an instinctive alarm. Major Cross stepped forward, opened the manila folder with theatrical precision. We've identified several patterns that require immediate attention. Equipment sign-out irregularities. Training deficiencies. Questionable judgment calls during patrol operations. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a sniper's rifle. Invisible but deadly. Sergeant Morrison, Steele said without turning around, remind the unit of our standards regarding equipment accountability. Morrison, a thin man with nervous eyes and 20 years of following orders, cleared his throat. Sir, Regulation 385-10 requires all personnel to properly maintain and secure issued equipment. Failure to comply results in counseling, retraining, and potential disciplinary action. Aria felt heat rising in her cheeks. Every MP in the room knew who'd experienced recent equipment failures. Everyone understood who was being discussed without being named. The military's favorite form of character assassination, public humiliation disguised as general guidance. Equipment malfunctions aren't necessarily indicative of poor maintenance, she said quietly. Sometimes gear fails despite proper care. The silence that followed her words was absolute. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward her like artillery pieces finding their target. In the military hierarchy, lieutenants didn't contradict colonels. Ever. Not in public briefings. Not without consequences. Steele's smile was predatory. Professional. Perfectly calibrated to convey disappointment without crossing any regulatory lines. Lieutenant Blackthorne. Thank you for that perspective. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate on your recent experiences with equipment reliability? The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Answer, and she'd be forced to either admit fault or criticize base operations. Remain silent, and she'd appear insubordinate. Either response would provide ammunition for future attacks. My equipment has functioned adequately when properly maintained, sir, Aria replied carefully. Any failures have been documented through proper channels and addressed by appropriate personnel. Adequately, Steele repeated, savoring the word like fine wine. An interesting standard for military operations. Major Cross, what's our expectation regarding equipment performance? Excellence, sir. Not adequacy. Excellence. Captain Grimm joined the assault with surgical precision. Perhaps Lieutenant Blackthorne would benefit from additional training on equipment maintenance. We can't have MPs in the field with gear that performs merely adequately. Staff Sergeant Kane, the senior enlisted advisor whose scarred arms testified to 3 combat deployments, nodded gravely. Equipment failure at the wrong moment gets people killed, sir. Can't take chances with marginal performance. Aria understood now. This wasn't about equipment. This was about establishing dominance, about putting her in her place, about making it clear that her presence was tolerated, not welcomed. They were testing her reaction, measuring her responses, probing for weaknesses they could exploit later. I agree completely, she said evenly. Equipment reliability is crucial for officer safety and mission success. I'd welcome any additional training that improves my effectiveness. The response clearly frustrated them. They'd expected defensiveness, anger, some emotional reaction they could use against her. Instead, she'd absorbed their attack and turned it into professional development. Judo instead of boxing. Steele's eyes narrowed slightly. Outstanding. Sergeant Torres, arrange for Lieutenant Blackthorne to receive comprehensive equipment training. All systems. All procedures. We want to ensure she meets our standards for excellence. Torres, a stocky man with dead eyes and bureaucrat's soul, made a note. Yes, sir. I'll schedule intensive sessions starting this week. Excellent. Now, regarding patrol assignments. Steele shifted topics smoothly, but the damage was done. The message had been delivered with military efficiency: fall in line, keep quiet, and remember your place. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. Routine matters handled with routine professionalism. But the atmosphere had changed. Aria could feel the weight of scrutiny, the subtle isolation that came from being marked as a problem. Other MPs avoided eye contact. Conversations quieted when she approached. The Brotherhood was closing ranks. After dismissal, Aria gathered her gear slowly, thinking. The attack had been coordinated, practiced, suggesting this wasn't spontaneous harassment but systematic campaign. 6 officers working in concert to establish her inferior status from the beginning. Lieutenant. She turned to find Major Cross approaching, his expression carefully neutral. Up close, he looked like an accountant in uniform, medium height, soft features, the kind of man who fought with paperwork instead of weapons. Sir. Word of advice, Cross said quietly, glancing around to ensure privacy. Fort Ashworth values team players. Officers who understand their role in the larger mission. Sometimes individual excellence matters less than unit cohesion. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Conform or face consequences. I understand my role, sir, Aria replied. Military police officer. Law enforcement. Protection of personnel and property. Cross's smile was winter cold. Your role, Lieutenant, is whatever Colonel Steele says it is. The sooner you grasp that reality, the smoother your tour will be. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Aria alone in the emptying briefing room. Through the windows, she could see the North Dakota plains stretching toward the horizon, endless and unforgiving under gray November skies. She thought about her father's garage back in Oregon, where honest work earned honest wages and competence spoke louder than politics. Where problems were solved with tools and determination rather than intimidation and manipulation. The Army had promised her something different. A meritocracy where performance mattered more than prejudice. Where the uniform created equality among those who wore it. Standing in that empty briefing room, Aria began to understand how wrong she'd been. The uniform didn't create equality. It simply provided camouflage for predators who'd learned to hunt within the system's rules. But Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne had never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were stacked against her. Especially when they were. Her father had taught her that bullies only understood one language, and sometimes good people had to speak it fluently. She didn't know yet that 6 officers had already decided she was too dangerous to tolerate. Didn't know they were planning something that would either break her completely or forge her into something harder than steel. All she knew was that Fort Ashworth had just declared war on her. And Aria Blackthorne had never lost a war she'd chosen to fight. The real battle was about to begin. The systematic campaign against Aria began 3 days after the briefing, implemented with the cold efficiency of a military operation. What made it particularly insidious was how perfectly it operated within regulatory boundaries. Every action defensible, every decision documented, every harassment masked as standard procedure. It started with her radio. During her first patrol of the week, Aria's communication device developed an intermittent static problem. Not complete failure, that would have triggered immediate replacement protocols, but enough interference to make clear transmissions difficult. When she reported the issue to Sergeant Morrison in communications, he logged the complaint with bureaucratic thoroughness and promised to look into it when time permits. The radio remained defective for 6 days. Her patrol vehicle followed a similar pattern. A 2019 Ford Explorer that had passed its last 3 inspections with flying colors suddenly developed a hesitation in the engine during acceleration. Not dangerous enough to be grounded, but unreliable enough to affect response times. Torres in logistics acknowledged the problem, scheduled maintenance as soon as the bay opens up, and assigned her a backup vehicle that was somehow always needed elsewhere when her shift began. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable. Equipment that worked perfectly for other MPs became mysteriously problematic in Aria's hands. Forms she submitted disappeared into administrative limbo. Training schedules changed without notice, leaving her excluded from critical briefings and skill updates. Major Cross orchestrated the psychological elements with surgical precision. Her performance evaluations, previously straightforward assessments of competence, became exercises in creative criticism. Adequate replaced excellent. Satisfactory substituted for outstanding. Comments focused on minor discrepancies and theoretical improvements rather than actual accomplishments. Lieutenant Blackthorne demonstrates basic competency in standard procedures, Red 1 evaluation, but would benefit from additional training in situational awareness and decision-making under pressure. The criticism was technically accurate, everyone could improve their situational awareness, while being fundamentally dishonest about her actual performance. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of assassination by 1,000 cuts. Captain Grimm's contribution came through training assignments. Suddenly, Aria found herself scheduled for every unpleasant detail available. Midnight security checks in the most remote areas of the base. Equipment inventories that required crawling through storage areas filled with dust and cobwebs. Traffic control during winter storms when visibility dropped to zero and temperatures plummeted below survival thresholds. Character building, Grimm explained when she questioned the pattern. Young officers need diverse experiences to develop proper judgment. The fact that male lieutenants with identical experience levels received standard rotations went unmentioned. Staff Sergeant Kane's approach was more direct. As senior enlisted advisor, he controlled the NCO network that actually ran day-to-day operations. His disapproval filtered down through the ranks like poison in a water supply. Suddenly, cooperation became grudging compliance. Support became the absolute minimum required by regulation. The informal mentoring that helped new officers navigate complex situations simply vanished. "Ma'am" became the standard response to her requests, delivered with perfect military courtesy and complete emotional distance. Technically respectful, practically isolating. The most damaging element was social ostracism. Fort Ashworth operated like a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The Officers' Club served as informal headquarters for career networking and social bonding. Invitations to retirement parties, promotion ceremonies, and unit celebrations normally included all available personnel. Aria's invitations stopped arriving. Not officially excluded, that would have violated clear regulations, but somehow overlooked when guest lists were compiled. Administrative oversight, Cross explained when she inquired about missed events. "We'll make sure you're included next time." Next time never came. The isolation was particularly effective because it operated through omission rather than commission. No one actively excluded her, she simply wasn't included. No one refused to work with her, they just forgot to coordinate their efforts. No one questioned her competence publicly, they simply stopped seeking her input privately. The campaign's sophistication lay in its legal defensibility. Every action had legitimate justification. Equipment problems happened. Training assignments were distributed based on operational needs. Performance evaluations reflected subjective assessments of professional development. Social events had limited capacity. Individually, each incident was explainable. Collectively, they formed a pattern of systematic harassment designed to break her spirit and force her resignation. Aria recognized the strategy because she'd studied it during her military police training. Institutional harassment was a known problem in military organizations, traditionally used against minorities, women, and anyone who didn't fit established norms. The solution, according to her textbooks, was documentation, patience, and faith in the system's ability to self-correct. She began keeping detailed records. Times, dates, witnesses, specific incidents. A careful catalog of each suspicious malfunction, each delayed response, each oversight that somehow only affected her operations. The evidence accumulated like snowfall, individually insignificant, collectively overwhelming. But documentation required someone willing to review it, and Aria was beginning to understand that the system itself was compromised. The breaking point came during a routine traffic stop that nearly ended in disaster. Aria had pulled over a speeding vehicle on Highway 2, the main road connecting Fort Ashworth to the civilian community. Standard procedure, verify identification, check for warrants, issue citation if appropriate. The driver was cooperative, a young civilian contractor heading home after his shift. When she called for backup to assist with paperwork, standard protocol for solo officers during night shifts, her radio produced only static. She tried multiple channels, multiple frequency adjustments, even switched to her backup handheld unit. Nothing but electronic noise. The traffic stop itself proceeded without incident, but the implications were terrifying. If the situation had escalated, if the driver had been armed or aggressive, if backup had been genuinely needed, she would have been completely isolated. No communication, no support, no way to call for help. Morrison's explanation was textbook bureaucratic deflection, atmospheric interference. Common during winter months. Radio waves behave differently in cold weather. The fact that other MPs experienced no similar problems went unaddressed. Aria realized that night that the campaign against her had escalated beyond harassment into active endangerment. They were no longer content to make her miserable, they were creating situations where she could be seriously injured or killed. The radio failure during a traffic stop was either criminal negligence or deliberate sabotage. She decided to fight back. Her first move was direct confrontation with Colonel Steele. She requested a private meeting, presented her documentation, and laid out the pattern of systematic harassment with military precision. Dates, times, witnesses, evidence. A prosecutor's case built with meticulous attention to detail. Steele listened with apparent concern, asked thoughtful questions, and promised thorough investigation. These allegations are serious, Lieutenant. If substantiated, they represent clear violations of military ethics and regulatory standards. 2 weeks later, he announced the results. Comprehensive review reveals no evidence of systematic harassment or discriminatory treatment. Equipment failures appear consistent with normal maintenance cycles. Training assignments reflect standard rotation protocols. Performance evaluations accurately reflect observed competencies. The investigation had been conducted by Major Cross, supervised by Captain Grimm, with input from the senior NCOs who were orchestrating the harassment. It was like asking bank robbers to investigate a missing vault. However, Steele continued, I am concerned about Lieutenant Blackthorne's tendency to interpret normal military operations as personal attacks. This suggests possible adjustment difficulties that require counseling and professional development. The masterstroke was elegant in its cruelty. By reporting harassment, she provided evidence of her own psychological instability. By documenting systematic discrimination, she'd proven her inability to adapt to military culture. Her attempt to seek justice had been transformed into proof of her unfitness for service. That night, alone in her barracks room, Aria stared at the ceiling and contemplated her options. Transfer requests took months to process and required command approval. Inspector General complaints faced similar obstacles and often resulted in retaliation against complainants. Civilian legal action was possible but career suicide in the military justice system. She was trapped in a system designed to protect itself rather than its members, surrounded by predators who understood how to hunt within regulatory boundaries. But Aria Blackthorne had inherited more than mechanical skills from her father. She'd learned that some fights couldn't be won through official channels, that some battles required unconventional tactics, and that sometimes the only way to defeat corruption was to force it into the open. She began planning her own campaign. Not harassment or intimidation, but something far more dangerous to her enemies, absolute professional excellence that would make their sabotage impossible to ignore. They wanted to break her through systematic pressure. She would respond with systematic perfection that would expose their crimes through contrast. Every report flawless, every procedure executed precisely, every regulation followed to the letter. They would either have to stop their harassment or escalate to methods that couldn't be disguised as administrative oversight. Either outcome would serve her purposes. But Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne underestimated the depths of their corruption and the lengths they would go to protect their power. 6 officers who had spent years perfecting their methods wouldn't be defeated by mere competence. They were preparing something that would either destroy her completely or provide the evidence she needed to destroy them. The real war was about to begin, and only one side understood the rules they were playing by. Aria's strategy of systematic excellence worked for exactly 17 days before it triggered the response she'd both hoped for and dreaded. Her flawless performance reports, perfectly executed procedures, and meticulous documentation created an undeniable contrast with the equipment failures and administrative oversights that plagued her operations. The pattern became so obvious that even willfully blind observers couldn't ignore it. Which was exactly what made her dangerous. The breaking point came during a routine inspection that should have been straightforward but became the catalyst for everything that followed. Fort Ashworth conducted monthly security assessments of all facilities, a standard procedure designed to identify vulnerabilities and ensure compliance with protection protocols. As the newest MP officer, Aria drew assignment to the ammunition storage complex, a series of reinforced bunkers containing everything from small arms rounds to artillery shells. The inspection was supposed to be routine. Walk the perimeter, check access controls, verify inventory security, file a report. 2 hours of methodical documentation in a secure area where nothing ever went wrong because nothing ever changed. Aria approached the assignment with her characteristic thoroughness, arriving 30 minutes early to review previous inspection reports and familiarize herself with facility layouts. The ammunition complex sat on the north side of the base, isolated from populated areas by 2 miles of open ground and triple-layer security fencing. Access required multiple clearances, biometric verification, and escort protocols that made unauthorized entry virtually impossible. Which was why discovering the breach was so shocking. The outer perimeter fence showed clear signs of tampering near the northeast corner. Wire cutters had been used to create a gap large enough for human passage, then the opening had been carefully concealed with zip ties and camouflage netting. Professional work. Military quality. Someone with training and access to proper equipment. Aria's heart hammered as she documented the breach with her camera, taking multiple angles and detailed measurements. This wasn't random vandalism or casual trespassing. This was systematic infiltration of a highly secure facility by someone who understood military security procedures. The middle fence revealed similar tampering, equally professional and equally concealed. By the time she reached the inner perimeter, Aria was operating on pure adrenaline and training. Her radio calls for backup produced the familiar static interference that had become synonymous with critical situations. The inner fence breach was different. Larger, more sophisticated, with electronic components that suggested someone had defeated the sensor systems. Whoever had done this possessed advanced technical knowledge and military-grade equipment. This wasn't a prank or protest. This was reconnaissance or sabotage by professionals. Aria's training screamed at her to retreat, to call for backup, to wait for support before proceeding. But her radio remained useless, and the integrity of the ammunition storage could affect the entire base. If someone had actually penetrated the bunkers, the potential consequences ranged from theft of military weapons to catastrophic explosion. She advanced toward the storage bunkers with weapon drawn, following protocols drilled into her through hundreds of training scenarios. Move carefully, assess threats, document everything, prioritize personnel safety over property protection. The first bunker appeared secure, locks intact, no signs of forced entry. Same with the second and third. Aria began to hope the intruders had been detected and deterred before reaching their objective. Maybe the breaches were failed attempts rather than successful penetration. Then she reached Bunker 7 and found the door standing open. Military ammunition storage followed strict protocols. Doors were secured with multiple locks, alarmed against unauthorized access, and monitored by surveillance systems. Finding an bunker door open was like finding the vault of Fort Knox unlocked, theoretically impossible, practically catastrophic. Aria keyed her radio again, praying for a clear signal. Base security, this is Unit 7. I have a security breach at Bunker 7, Ammunition Storage Complex. Request immediate backup and bomb disposal team. Static. Always static when she needed communication most. She approached the bunker entrance carefully, weapon ready, every sense heightened. The interior was dark, illuminated only by emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows across rows of ammunition containers. Everything appeared to be in order, no obvious signs of theft or sabotage. Then she noticed the tripwire. Military experience saved her life. The thin strand of fishing line stretched across the entrance at ankle height, barely visible in the dim lighting. Following the line with her eyes, Aria traced it to a device attached to the wall, a military-grade explosive charge connected to what appeared to be stolen ammunition. Someone had booby-trapped the bunker. Not to steal weapons, but to kill whoever discovered the breach. Aria backed away slowly, every movement calculated to avoid disturbing the deadly mechanism. This was beyond her training, beyond her equipment, beyond anything she was qualified to handle. This required explosive ordnance disposal specialists, evacuation protocols, and immediate command notification. But her radio remained dead, and she was alone in a facility that had been turned into a death trap by someone with military training and access to restricted materials. The implications hit her like physical blows. This wasn't random terrorism or outside infiltration. This was an inside job, planned and executed by someone with intimate knowledge of base security, access to military explosives, and the ability to predict inspection schedules. Someone who knew she would be conducting this inspection. Someone who wanted her dead and had the skills to arrange it. The pieces fell together with terrifying clarity. The systematic harassment, the equipment failures, the communication problems, it had all been preparation for this moment. They hadn't been trying to force her resignation. They'd been setting up her murder. Aria retreated from the ammunition complex with careful urgency, documenting everything while staying clear of potential blast radius. If the device detonated, it would likely trigger secondary explosions that could level half the storage facility and kill anyone within a mile radius. But reaching safety meant crossing 2 miles of open ground with no communication, no backup, and no certainty that other booby traps hadn't been planted along her route. Every step could trigger an explosion. Every shadow could conceal another device. She made it halfway to the main base before they found her. 3 vehicles approached from different directions, boxing her in with professional precision. Military police vehicles with official markings and proper protocols. For a moment, Aria felt relief. Backup had finally arrived, communication had been restored, help was available. Then she recognized the occupants. Major Cross stepped out of the lead vehicle with the calm efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. Captain Grimm emerged from the second, followed by Staff Sergeants Kane and Torres. Sergeant Morrison brought up the rear, his nervous energy suggesting he understood the gravity of what they were about to do. Colonel Steele remained in his vehicle, visible through the windshield but maintaining plausible deniability. He could claim later that he'd been responding to reports of suspicious activity, that he'd arrived to find his subordinates handling an unfortunate situation involving an unstable officer who'd made serious allegations against respected personnel. Lieutenant Blackthorne, Cross called out with false concern. We received reports of erratic behavior and security violations. Are you experiencing some kind of crisis? The setup was elegant in its simplicity. If she reported the booby trap, they would claim she'd planted it herself as part of a psychological breakdown. If she accused them of attempted murder, they would point to her previous, unfounded, harassment complaints as evidence of paranoid delusions. There's a bomb in Bunker 7, Aria said quietly, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. Improvised explosive device connected to stolen ammunition. Professional quality work. Cross exchanged glances with his colleagues, a performance of concerned confusion. That's a very serious allegation, Lieutenant. Are you certain of what you observed? Completely certain. I have photographs, measurements, documentation. The entire ammunition complex has been compromised by someone with military training and access to restricted materials. Kane stepped closer, his scarred hands relaxed but ready. Ma'am, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Performance issues, adjustment problems, complaints about your fellow officers. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there. The tripwire was fishing line, ankle height, connected to approximately 2 pounds of C4 explosive, Aria continued steadily. Designed to kill whoever discovered the breach and destroy evidence of the penetration. Torres circled behind her while Morrison moved to cut off retreat routes. Professional flanking maneuver disguised as concerned support. Lieutenant, Grimm said with practiced patience, I think you need medical evaluation. You're describing elaborate conspiracy theories, making serious accusations without evidence, exhibiting signs of psychological distress. Steele finally emerged from his vehicle, playing the role of concerned commander faced with a mentally unstable subordinate. Aria, I understand you've been struggling with the pressures of military service. There's no shame in seeking help when the stress becomes overwhelming. The moment crystallized with perfect clarity. 6 officers standing in a circle around her, pretending concern while preparing violence. The ammunition complex behind them, containing evidence they'd kill to protect. 2 miles of isolation between them and potential witnesses. They'd planned this perfectly. Her death would be explained as suicide by an unstable officer who'd finally succumbed to adjustment disorders and paranoid delusions. The booby trap would be discovered later, attributed to her final act of revenge against the system that had persecuted her. I need to report these findings through proper channels, Aria said carefully, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Explosive ordnance disposal, security investigations, proper documentation. I'm afraid that's not possible, Cross replied with genuine regret. You're clearly experiencing a psychological emergency. We can't allow you access to weapons or sensitive areas until you've been properly evaluated. Kane moved closer, his intentions unmistakable. Ma'am, I need you to surrender your sidearm and submit to escort back to base medical facility. Aria's hand moved toward her weapon instinctively. 6 against 1, isolated location, no communication, no witnesses. But she was still a military police officer with training, equipment, and legal authority. More importantly, she was her father's daughter, raised to fight when fighting was necessary and to never surrender to bullies regardless of the odds. I decline medical evaluation, she said clearly. I am reporting a security breach through proper channels and requesting immediate explosive ordnance disposal response. Steele nodded to his men. I'm sorry it's come to this, Lieutenant. But you're clearly a danger to yourself and others. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, Kane from the front, Torres from behind, Morrison from the left. Professional coordination, practiced teamwork, overwhelming force designed to subdue rather than kill. At least initially. But they had underestimated the lessons her father had taught in that Oregon garage, the skills she developed through years of training, and the desperation of someone fighting for their life against impossible odds. Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne had 16 minutes to prove she was more dangerous than they'd calculated. The attack unfolded with military precision, but Aria's response came from somewhere deeper than training, the primal instinct of someone who'd grown up fighting for everything she'd ever earned. Kane's frontal assault was textbook takedown technique, designed to overwhelm through superior size and experience. His approach telegraphed confidence in a quick resolution: grab her arms, control her weapon, subdue her before she could resist effectively. 3 decades of military service had taught him that superior numbers and coordinated tactics always prevailed against isolated opponents. He was about to learn how wrong institutional arrogance could be. Aria's father had taught her that fights were won in the first 3 seconds, before adrenaline-clouded judgment and desperation replaced strategy. Baby girl, he'd said while teaching her to change oil at age 12, bullies always expect you to fight their fight. Surprise them. Make them fight yours. Instead of retreating or drawing her weapon as expected, Aria stepped into Kane's charge, using his momentum against him. Her elbow caught his solar plexus with surgical precision, driving the breath from his lungs and doubling him over. Before he could recover, her knee connected with his descending face, breaking his nose in a spray of blood and cartilage. Kane dropped like a felled tree, unconscious before he hit the frozen ground. Torres, approaching from behind, had expected to grab her arms while Kane controlled the front. Finding himself suddenly facing an opponent who'd eliminated his partner in less than 2 seconds, he hesitated, a fatal mistake in close-quarters combat. Aria spun toward him, her hand already moving to her service weapon. But Torres was combat experienced, a veteran of 2 deployments who'd survived firefights in Iraq. His own weapon was clearing its holster when Aria's boot caught him in the knee with devastating accuracy. The joint bent sideways with an audible crack. Torres screamed, his weapon flying wide as he collapsed, clutching his destroyed leg. Modern military medicine could probably save the knee, but he'd never run again, never serve in combat units, never be the same soldier who'd followed Steele's orders without question. Morrison, approaching from the left flank, froze at the sight of 2 senior NCOs neutralized in less than 5 seconds. His nerve broke completely. Instead of pressing the attack, he scrambled backward, reaching for his radio, shouting into static-filled airways for backup that wouldn't come. Cross and Grimm exchanged glances of pure shock. The coordinated takedown of a single lieutenant had just become a tactical disaster that left 2 of their conspirators broken and bleeding in North Dakota mud. Jesus Christ, Grimm breathed, his hand moving toward his weapon. How did she? Doesn't matter, Cross cut him off, his intelligence officer mind already calculating damage control. We finish this now, or we all go down. Colonel Steele stepped forward, his command presence reasserting itself despite the chaos. 35 years of military leadership had taught him that soldiers followed strength, even in desperate situations. Especially in desperate situations. Stand down, Lieutenant, he barked with parade ground authority. You've just assaulted 2 senior non-commissioned officers. Surrender immediately or face additional charges. Aria's weapon was in her hands now, trained on the 3 remaining officers with rock-steady precision. Her father's lessons echoed in her memory: when cornered by multiple attackers, create distance, control the engagement, force them to react to your actions. I'm placing all of you under arrest, she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the empty ground. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted assassination of a federal officer, destruction of military property, violation of explosive safety protocols. Cross laughed, the sound brittle in the cold air. Who's going to believe you, Lieutenant? 6 decorated officers versus 1 unstable woman with a history of false accusations? Your credibility is already destroyed. The evidence speaks for itself, Aria replied. Booby trap in Bunker 7, systematic equipment sabotage, documented harassment patterns. Physical evidence doesn't lie. Evidence can be explained, Steele said calmly. Psychological breakdown, revenge fantasies, dangerous delusions. You've just proven how unstable you are by attacking fellow soldiers. Grimm was circling slowly to her left, trying to get an angle while she focused on the other 2. Professional flanking maneuver disguised as casual movement. In 30 seconds, he'd be in position to rush her from the side while Cross and Steele distracted her from the front. Aria tracked his movement with peripheral vision while maintaining her primary focus on Steele and Cross. 3 opponents at different distances, varying levels of cover, multiple angles of attack. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Your move, Lieutenant, Cross said with false calm. Surrender now, and we can claim you suffered a psychological episode. Resist further, and this becomes a justified shooting of a dangerous, unstable officer who attacked her superiors. Morrison had stopped calling for backup, apparently realizing his radio was as useless as everyone else's in Aria's presence. Instead, he was tending to Torres, whose leg bent at an impossible angle, blood seeping through torn fabric. Kane remained unconscious, his face a mask of blood from his shattered nose. Medical attention, Aria called out without taking her eyes off the 3 standing officers. Those men need immediate medical care. They need it because of your unprovoked assault, Steele replied coldly. Violence you initiated without cause or justification. Grimm had reached optimal flanking position. Cross had shifted slightly right, creating crossfire angles. The tactical net was closing, and Aria faced a terrible choice: surrender to men who'd already tried to kill her once, or shoot fellow officers in what would appear to be an unprovoked attack. Either option destroyed her. Surrender meant death disguised as suicide. Resistance meant court-martial for assault on superior officers, assuming she survived the immediate confrontation. But her father had taught her that some choices weren't really choices at all. When bullies cornered you, when the system failed, when authority became corruption, sometimes the only moral response was to fight back regardless of consequences. Last chance, Lieutenant, Cross said quietly. Drop your weapon and submit to arrest. We'll make sure you receive appropriate medical care. Medical care. The phrase was loaded with implication. Psychiatric evaluation, psychological medication, involuntary commitment to protect the military from unstable personnel. A sanitized way of disappearing someone who knew too much and wouldn't stay quiet. Aria made her decision. Counterproposal, she said clearly. All three of you assume the position for arrest. Hands behind your heads, fingers interlocked, kneel on the ground. I'll escort you to the base commander for formal charges. Steele's expression shifted from authority to naked anger. You're making a serious mistake, Lieutenant. Think about your career, your future, your family. Is dying in this field really worth proving a point? The threat was explicit now. Not arrest, not court-martial, but death. Murder disguised as justifiable force against a dangerous officer. They'd reached the point where subtlety was abandoned in favor of crude intimidation. My family taught me to fight bullies, Aria replied steadily. Even when they wear uniforms. Especially when they wear uniforms. Grimm made his move first, rushing from the left flank while Cross drew his weapon from the front. Coordinated attack, overwhelming force, the same tactics that had worked against countless enemies in foreign wars. But Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne wasn't a foreign enemy. She was an American soldier trained to the same standards, equipped with the same weapons, motivated by principles they'd abandoned years ago. More importantly, she was fighting for her life while they were fighting to protect their careers. Desperation always trumped arrogance. Aria pivoted toward Grimm's charge, her weapon tracking smoothly to center mass. 2 shots, center of gravity, textbook marksmanship that dropped him instantly. No hesitation, no warning, just professional violence applied with surgical precision. Cross's weapon was clearing leather when Aria's 3rd and 4th shots took him in the chest, spinning him around and depositing him in the frozen mud beside his unconscious colleagues. He'd been reaching for his service pistol. She'd beaten him by half a second that might as well have been half an hour. Steele froze with his weapon half drawn, suddenly facing the reality that his carefully planned murder had become a tactical nightmare. 2 officers dead, 2 disabled, 1 terrified communications specialist cowering behind a vehicle, and 1 very angry lieutenant with a smoking gun and legal justification for everything she'd done. Drop your weapon, Colonel, Aria commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This ends now. Steele's hand trembled on his pistol grip. 35 years of military service, Silver Star recipient, decorated combat veteran reduced to a moment of pure choice, surrender to a subordinate or die trying to maintain his authority. You don't understand what you've done, he said quietly. This goes beyond us. Beyond this base. You've just declared war on a system that's bigger than any individual. Then the system needs to change, Aria replied. Starting with you. Colonel Jackson Steele, architect of systematic harassment and attempted murder, slowly raised his hands in surrender. For the first time in his career, superior rank meant nothing. Training meant nothing. Experience meant nothing. All that mattered was that Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne held the gun, held the evidence, and held the moral high ground that came from fighting back against institutional corruption. But as she stood in that frozen field with 4 casualties and 1 prisoner, Aria understood that winning this battle was only the beginning. The system Steele had mentioned, the network of officers who protected each other, who covered up crimes, who valued loyalty over justice, would close ranks to protect itself. She'd just become the most dangerous person on Fort Ashworth, a victim who'd refused to stay victimized, a whistleblower with evidence, a survivor with nothing left to lose. The real fight was about to begin. The immediate aftermath of the shootout unfolded with surreal clarity, each detail etched into Aria's memory with photographic precision. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood on frozen ground. Morrison's panicked breathing created visible clouds in the November air. Colonel Steele's hands remained raised, but his eyes calculated angles and opportunities with the patience of a career survivor. Aria maintained her weapon's sight picture on Steele while processing the tactical situation. 4 men down, 2 dead, 2 wounded, 1 prisoner, 1 cowering witness. No communication with base headquarters. No backup en route. No official record of her location or activities. The perfect setup for a cover-up. Morrison, she called without taking her eyes off Steele. Check Cross and Grim for vitals. The communications specialist emerged from behind the vehicle with trembling hands, his face pale as morning frost. 20 years of following orders had prepared him for many things, but not for checking whether his superiors were dead or merely dying. Ma'am, I don't know how to. Pulse check. Neck or wrist. Do it now. Morrison knelt beside Cross first, his fingers fumbling for the carotid artery with amateur uncertainty. After 30 seconds of searching, he looked up with sick certainty. No pulse, ma'am. Grimm's assessment took longer, Hope making the process more thorough. But the result was identical. 2 center mass hits had done their work with professional efficiency. Both Kia, Morrison reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Aria absorbed the information without emotion. She'd killed 2 men in self-defense, eliminated 2 threats to her life and potentially to national security. The technical aspects were straightforward, justifiable under military rules of engagement and federal law. The political aspects were catastrophic. Colonel, she addressed Steele while maintaining sight alignment, instruct Morrison to call for medical evacuation, explosive ordnance disposal, and command presence. All available frequencies. Steele's laugh was bitter. You think this ends with medical teams and investigation reports? You just killed 2 field-grade officers. Decorated combat veterans. Men with families, with service records, with reputations. I killed 2 conspirators who attempted murder, Aria corrected. Men who booby-trapped ammunition storage and tried to eliminate the witness to their crimes. Prove it. Steele's confidence was returning as shock faded into tactical thinking. Prove conspiracy. Prove attempted murder. Prove anything beyond a mentally unstable lieutenant who cracked under pressure and attacked her superiors. Morrison was trying his radio with increasing desperation, cycling through frequencies and power settings. The static remained constant, suggesting systematic jamming rather than atmospheric interference. The evidence speaks for itself, Aria replied. Booby trap in Bunker 7. Systematic equipment sabotage. Documented harassment patterns. Your presence here with 5 subordinates proves coordination. My presence here proves I responded to reports of suspicious activity, Steele countered smoothly. Intelligence suggested possible terrorist infiltration of ammunition storage. I brought my best people to investigate. The narrative was taking shape even as they spoke. Steele was already constructing the official version, concerned commander investigating security threats, unstable officer suffering psychological breakdown, tragic misunderstanding that resulted in unnecessary casualties. And when we arrived, he continued, we found you exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress. Paranoid delusions about explosive devices. Aggressive behavior toward superior officers. When we attempted to provide assistance, you opened fire without provocation. Kane was regaining consciousness, groaning through his shattered nose. Torres remained motionless but breathing, his destroyed knee requiring immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent disability. Morrison will corroborate my version, Steele said with growing confidence. Won't you, Sergeant? Morrison looked between them with the trapped expression of someone caught between impossible choices. Support his colonel's lies and become complicit in murder. Tell the truth and destroy his own career while supporting an officer who just killed 2 men. I don't know what I saw, sir, Morrison stammered. Everything happened so fast. The lieutenant was agitated, talking about bombs and conspiracies. You and the others were trying to help, and then she started shooting, Steele finished. Unprovoked violence against fellow soldiers. Tragic outcome of untreated psychological problems. Aria realized the full scope of the trap with crystalline clarity. Even surviving the assassination attempt, even defending herself successfully, even having physical evidence of their crimes, none of it mattered if the narrative was controlled by the same system that had protected them originally. The explosive device in Bunker 7, she said firmly. Physical evidence of will be attributed to your psychological breakdown, Steele interrupted. Revenge fantasy carried out by an unstable officer seeking to justify her violent actions. EOD will find your fingerprints on the device, your access codes in the security logs, your psychological profile suggesting exactly this kind of behavior. The setup was masterful in its simplicity. They'd planned for every contingency, including her survival. The booby trap wasn't meant to frame her for terrorism, it was meant to provide post-mortem justification for their actions. When she survived and fought back, it became evidence of her guilt rather than their conspiracy. Morrison, Steele continued, activate emergency protocols. Officer involved shooting, multiple casualties, request immediate command response and psychological evaluation team. Morrison's hand moved toward his radio, then stopped. For 20 years, he'd followed orders without question, trusted the chain of command, believed the system protected good soldiers from bad situations. But good soldiers didn't booby-trap ammunition bunkers. Good soldiers didn't coordinate attacks on fellow officers. Good soldiers didn't stand over bleeding comrades while constructing elaborate lies. Sergeant, Steele's voice carried parade ground authority. That's a direct order. Morrison looked at Kane, semiconscious and bloody. At Torres, white-faced with shock and pain. At Cross and Grimm, still and silent in the frozen mud. At Aria, holding a smoking weapon with rock-steady hands. Sir, he said quietly, I need to understand what really happened here before I make any calls. Steele's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. Morrison's cooperation was essential for the cover-up, but his questioning suggested doubt that could prove fatal to the entire conspiracy. What happened, Sergeant, is that Lieutenant Blackthorne suffered a severe psychological episode and attacked her superior officers. Your job is to report that fact through proper channels, not to conduct unauthorized investigations. But the ammunition bunker is Lieutenant Blackthorne's responsibility. Her sector, her inspection, her psychological break. The device will be traced to her through proper investigative procedures. Morrison stared at his colonel with dawning horror. 20 years of faithful service, of following orders, of trusting the system, crumbling under the weight of institutional corruption. You're asking me to lie in an official report, he said slowly. I'm ordering you to report the facts as you observed them, Steele corrected. A mentally unstable officer exhibiting paranoid behavior who opened fire on fellow soldiers attempting to provide assistance. The radio in Morrison's hand remained silent. His finger hovered over the transmit button while his conscience wrestled with 20 years of military conditioning. Support the system that had given him career and purpose, or support the truth that could destroy everything he'd believed about military honor. Make the call, Morrison, Aria said quietly. But remember that your report will be part of the official record. Sworn testimony in potential courts-martial. Statements that will be investigated, corroborated, and verified. Sergeant Morrison, Steele's voice hardened with command authority, you have a direct order from a superior officer. Failure to comply constitutes insubordination and potential court-martial charges. Morrison looked between them, the colonel who'd commanded his loyalty for 8 years, and the lieutenant who'd just killed 2 men while defending herself against impossible odds. The choice wasn't between right and wrong anymore. It was between competing versions of duty, honor, and truth. Sir, Morrison said finally, his voice steady despite his trembling hands, I need to report a complex situation involving multiple casualties and conflicting accounts. I'll let the investigators determine what actually happened here. He keyed the radio and began transmitting on emergency frequencies, his words carefully neutral but accurate. Base command, this is Unit 7 with Priority 1 emergency. Multiple casualties at ammunition storage complex. Officer involved shooting. Request immediate medical response, explosive ordnance disposal, and command investigation team. Steele's face went gray as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of honest reporting. Without Morrison's cooperation, the cover-up became impossible. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, too many questions that couldn't be answered with simple lies. You just destroyed your own career, Sergeant, he said quietly. Maybe, Morrison replied, still transmitting coordinates and casualty reports. But at least I can look at myself in the mirror tomorrow. Aria maintained her weapon's sight picture on Steele while listening to Morrison's transmission. Medical teams were en route, investigators were being notified, an explosive ordnance disposal was mobilizing to address the ammunition bunker threat. The immediate tactical situation was stabilizing, but the strategic implications were just beginning. She'd survived assassination, defended herself successfully, and secured honest testimony from a critical witness. But Steele was right about one thing: the system they'd all served would protect itself, even at the cost of individual justice. "Colonel," she said clearly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted assassination of a federal officer, and violation of explosive safety protocols. You have the right to remain silent." Steele smiled with the confidence of someone who understood institutional power better than legal procedure. "Lieutenant, you have no idea what you've started. This goes far beyond Fort Ashworth, far beyond a few officers making hard choices about unit cohesion." "Then maybe it's time for some changes," Aria replied. "Starting with accountability for criminal behavior." As sirens wailed in the distance and help finally approached, Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne understood that surviving the physical attack was only the beginning. Now came the hardest battle of all, proving the truth to a system designed to protect its own, regardless of guilt or innocence. But she was still standing, still breathing, still holding the smoking gun that had saved her life. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. The convoy of emergency vehicles arrived with military precision, transforming the isolated ammunition complex into a command center of controlled chaos. Medical teams, military police investigators, explosive ordnance disposal specialists, and base command staff converged on the scene with the efficiency of professionals responding to a crisis they'd trained for but hoped never to face. Aria maintained her position with weapon trained on Colonel Steele until the first MP investigator, a female captain she didn't recognize, approached with hands visible and voice calm. "Lieutenant Blackthorne, I'm Captain Sarah Reynolds, Criminal Investigation Division. I need you to lower your weapon and step back from the prisoner." The moment crystallized everything Aria had feared about institutional response. Despite Morrison's accurate reporting, despite physical evidence of conspiracy, despite obvious signs of coordinated attack, the arriving investigators treated her as the primary threat rather than the victim. "Captain, I'm maintaining custody of a prisoner who attempted murder," Aria replied steadily. "Colonel Steele and his subordinates planted explosive devices in ammunition storage and tried to kill me when I discovered their operation." Reynolds exchanged glances with the male MP lieutenant flanking her left side. Their body language suggested skepticism rather than support, doubt rather than investigation. The narrative was already forming: unstable officer making wild accusations against respected superiors. "Lieutenant, we need to secure the scene and provide medical attention to wounded personnel," Reynolds continued with practiced patience. "Lower your weapon and allow us to assume control." Steele seized the opportunity with political instincts honed over 35 years of military service. "Captain Reynolds, thank God you're here. Lieutenant Blackthorne has suffered some kind of psychological break. She's making paranoid accusations about explosive devices and conspiracy theories involving senior officers." "I have physical evidence," Aria interrupted firmly. "Booby trap in Bunker 7, documented harassment patterns, systematic equipment sabotage. Everything is documented with photographs and detailed reports." The explosive ordnance disposal team was already moving toward the bunkers with professional urgency, their detection equipment sweeping for threats. If Aria was right about the device, they'd find corroborating evidence within minutes. If she was wrong, her credibility would be destroyed completely. "Ma'am," the MP lieutenant addressed Aria with careful neutrality, "we need to separate all parties for individual interviews. Standard procedure for officer-involved shootings." Separation meant isolation. Isolation meant individual interrogation without legal representation or witness protection. Standard procedure designed to break down coordinated lies, but equally effective for suppressing inconvenient truths. "I want legal representation before any interviews," Aria stated clearly. "And protective custody pending investigation of attempted murder charges." Reynolds frowned. "Lieutenant, requesting legal counsel suggests you believe you've committed crimes requiring defense. Are you confessing to wrongdoing?" The legal trap was elegant in its simplicity. Request a lawyer, and appear guilty of criminal behavior. Cooperate without counsel, and provide statements that could be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Steele pressed his advantage with the skill of someone who understood bureaucratic warfare. "Captain, I'm deeply concerned about Lieutenant Blackthorne's mental state. She's exhibited paranoid behavior, made unfounded accusations against multiple superior officers, and now shows signs of persecution complex." "Colonel," Morrison interrupted with unexpected courage, "that's not what I observed. The lieutenant discovered legitimate security breaches and was attacked when she attempted to report them." Every eye turned toward Morrison, whose 20 years of faithful service suddenly made him the most credible witness on scene. His support for Aria's version carried weight that her own testimony couldn't match. "Sergeant Morrison," Reynolds addressed him directly, "what exactly did you observe?" Morrison's face was pale, but his voice remained steady. "Sir, I observed Lieutenant Blackthorne reporting explosive devices in ammunition storage. When she attempted to communicate these findings, Colonel Steele and 5 other officers surrounded her in what appeared to be a coordinated confrontation." "Appeared to be," Steele repeated with emphasis. Sergeant Morrison wasn't privy to command decisions regarding response to security threats. He misinterpreted a rescue operation as something sinister. The EOD team's radio crackled with urgent transmission. "Command, this is Dispose 1. We have confirmation of improvised explosive device in Bunker 7. Military grade C, for connected to tripwire mechanism. Site is dangerous, require immediate area evacuation." Silence fell over the scene like a physical weight. Aria's allegations had just been corroborated by independent technical analysis. The device was real, professional, and deadly. Reynolds processed this information with visible recalculation. Physical evidence couldn't be dismissed as paranoid delusion or psychological breakdown. Someone had booby-trapped military ammunition storage, and the question became who rather than whether. "Colonel Steele," she addressed him with new formality, "do you have any knowledge of explosive devices being placed in base ammunition storage?" Steele's composure never wavered, 35 years of command experience serving him well under pressure. "Captain, I responded to intelligence reports suggesting possible terrorist infiltration of ammunition storage. My concern was preventing exactly this kind of security breach." "Intelligence from what source?" "Classified. But I can provide proper documentation through appropriate channels." The answer was bureaucratically perfect, specific enough to sound legitimate, classified enough to prevent immediate verification. Intelligence reports could be manufactured retroactively, sources protected under operational security protocols. "And your presence here with 5 subordinates?" "Standard response protocol for ammunition security threats. Coordinated approach using experienced personnel familiar with explosive safety procedures." Aria watched the narrative reconstruction with growing alarm. Every answer was plausible, every explanation defensible, every detail carefully crafted to support predetermined conclusions. Steele was transforming attempted murder into heroic response, conspiracy into miscommunication. "Captain," she interrupted urgently, "check Colonel Steele's access logs for ammunition storage. Verify his personnel assignments for the past month. Cross-reference equipment failures with his operational oversight." Reynolds looked between them with the expression of someone trying to navigate competing claims without sufficient information. Physical evidence supported explosive devices, but that didn't necessarily implicate Steele. Witness testimony was conflicted, official records would require time to verify. The medical teams had stabilized Kane and Torres for transport, their conditions serious but not life-threatening. Cross and Grimm remained covered under military-issue blankets, their deaths requiring investigation and autopsy procedures. "Lieutenant Blackthorne," Reynolds said finally, "you'll be transported to base medical facility for evaluation and debriefing. Colonel Steele will be interviewed regarding security protocols and incident response." Evaluation meant psychiatric assessment. Debriefing meant interrogation without legal protection. Interview meant voluntary cooperation with fellow officers who understood institutional loyalty. "I want protective custody," Aria repeated firmly. "And legal representation before any medical evaluation." "Ma'am, medical evaluation is standard procedure following traumatic incidents. It's for your own protection and well-being." Protection and well-being administered by the same medical staff who reported to the same chain of command that had just tried to kill her. Treatment provided by professionals who understood that certain conditions required certain conclusions. Morrison stepped forward with unexpected resolve. "Captain, I want my testimony recorded immediately. On scene, with witnesses present, before anyone disappears or stories change." His intervention was brilliant in its simplicity. Immediate recorded testimony would lock in his account before pressure could be applied to alter his statements. Official documentation would make retroactive changes impossible. "That's irregular," Reynolds protested. "Standard procedure requires individual interviews in controlled environments." "Standard procedure," Morrison replied with growing confidence, "doesn't cover assassination attempts against fellow officers. I want my statement preserved before anyone decides I misunderstood what I saw." Steele's expression darkened as he recognized the threat Morrison represented. Honest testimony from a credible witness could unravel the entire cover-up operation. "Sergeant Morrison," he said with quiet authority, "you're clearly suffering from shock and stress following this traumatic incident. Medical evaluation would be appropriate before providing formal statements." Medical evaluation. The same solution offered to Aria: psychiatric control disguised as healthcare, institutional protection prioritized over individual rights. "Sir," Morrison replied with unexpected steel in his voice, "I've been thinking clearly for 20 years. I can think clearly for 20 minutes while I tell the truth about what happened here." The confrontation was crystallizing into competing visions of military justice: truth versus loyalty, evidence versus authority, individual conscience versus institutional protection. Captain Reynolds looked between them with growing understanding that this incident involved far more than a simple officer-involved shooting. The explosive device proved deliberate criminal activity. The coordinated response suggested conspiracy. The conflicting testimonies indicated systematic deception. "All parties will be separated for individual interviews," she announced with newfound authority. "Colonel Steele, you're restricted to base pending investigation. Lieutenant Blackthorne, you'll receive medical evaluation and legal counsel. Sergeant Morrison, your testimony will be recorded with full protection protocols." It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Separation prevented coordination of lies, restriction limited Steele's operational freedom, and protection acknowledged Morrison's vulnerable position. As military police vehicles prepared to transport them to different locations, Aria caught Morrison's eye across the crowd of investigators. He nodded slightly, a signal of solidarity from one soldier to another, a promise that truth would be told regardless of personal consequences. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since discovering the ammunition bunker breach, Aria felt something approaching hope. The physical fight was finished, but the legal war was just beginning. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. The base medical facility at Fort Ashworth operated with the sterile efficiency of military healthcare, where treatment protocols served institutional needs as much as patient welfare. Aria found herself in a private room under what officials termed protective observation, medical supervision that felt suspiciously like house arrest. Dr. Elizabeth Chin, the base psychiatrist, entered with the measured movements of someone accustomed to evaluating dangerous patients. Her credentials were impeccable: Harvard Medical School, residency at Walter Reed, 15 years of military psychiatric experience. She also reported directly to the same chain of command that had just tried to eliminate Aria. "Lieutenant Blackthorne," Dr. Chen said with professional warmth, "I'm here to conduct a routine psychological evaluation following your traumatic experience. Nothing invasive, just standard assessment to ensure you're coping appropriately." The medical chart in her hands was already thick with preliminary reports, initial assessments, and background information that had somehow been compiled with remarkable speed. Aria recognized the efficiency of institutional damage control operating at maximum effectiveness. "Doctor, I want legal representation present during any evaluation," Aria stated firmly. "I'm the victim of attempted murder, not a patient requiring psychiatric treatment." Dr. Chen's expression remained professionally neutral. "Lieutenant, legal counsel isn't typically necessary for medical evaluation. This is healthcare, not interrogation. My only concern is your psychological welfare following clearly traumatic events." "Traumatic events?" The phrase was loaded with implications about Aria's mental state, her reliability as a witness, her fitness for continued military service. Medical terminology that could be weaponized in legal proceedings. "My psychological welfare is fine," Aria replied. "What I need is protection from officers who tried to kill me and are now attempting to discredit my testimony through psychiatric manipulation." Dr. Chen made careful notes, each observation potentially useful for future character assassination. "I understand you've made serious allegations against respected officers. That kind of stress can create psychological pressure that manifests in various ways." The interview continued for 90 minutes, Dr. Chen probing for signs of paranoia, persecution complex, delusional thinking, or other conditions that could undermine Aria's credibility. Each question was clinically appropriate while serving prosecutorial purposes. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in the base legal office, Major Jennifer Walsh was discovering that representing Lieutenant Blackthorne would be the most politically dangerous assignment of her career. Walsh had graduated from Georgetown Law, served 8 years as a military defense attorney, and maintained an spotless record of professional competence. She understood military justice, federal criminal law, and the institutional pressures that could destroy careers overnight. Reading Aria's case file, she recognized a legal nightmare disguised as routine investigation. Physical evidence supported explosive devices in ammunition storage. Witness testimony was conflicted but included credible support for assassination allegations. The defendants were senior officers with decades of exemplary service records. "Captain Morrison's statement is problematic," Walsh muttered, reviewing transcripts from his recorded interview. His testimony directly contradicted official explanations, supported Aria's version of events, and provided corroborating evidence of conspiracy. But Morrison was also a 20-year veteran whose career depended on institutional loyalty. Pressure would be applied, subtle, professional, devastating, to encourage clarification of his recollections. The preliminary investigation had been assigned to Lieutenant Colonel David Pierce, a career military lawyer with ambitions for general stars. Pierce understood that high-profile cases could either launch careers into the stratosphere or destroy them completely. Political considerations weighed heavily in his strategic calculations. Pierce's preliminary assessment was masterful in its bureaucratic neutrality. Initial evidence suggests complex incident involving security breach response, officer-involved shooting, and conflicting testimony requiring thorough investigation to determine factual accuracy. Translation, stall, delay, and hope political solutions could be negotiated before legal proceedings became unavoidable. The media attention was already building. Local news outlets had picked up reports of incident at Fort Ashworth involving multiple casualties. National security reporters were making inquiries about ammunition storage security and potential terrorist infiltration. Public affairs officers were crafting careful statements. Fort Ashworth experienced a security incident that was rapidly contained by appropriate personnel. No ongoing threat exists to base security or community safety. Investigation is proceeding through proper military channels. Every word was technically accurate while revealing nothing substantial about attempted assassination, institutional conspiracy, or systematic corruption. Dr. Chen completed her evaluation with conclusions that surprised no one. Lieutenant Blackthorne exhibits signs of acute stress reaction following traumatic events. Recommendation for continued observation and potential fitness for duty assessment pending psychological stability. Acute stress reaction was psychiatrically appropriate for someone who'd been attacked and forced to kill in self-defense. It was also legally useful for questioning her mental competency as a witness. Fitness for duty assessment was the administrative mechanism for removing problematic personnel from active service. Medical discharge based on psychological unfitness would eliminate Aria as a threat while maintaining institutional deniability. But Dr. Chen had made one critical error in her assessment. She'd focused so intently on finding pathology that she'd missed signs of extraordinary psychological resilience. Aria's responses indicated someone who'd processed trauma effectively, maintained clear thinking under extreme pressure, and demonstrated remarkable emotional stability. Those findings would later prove problematic when defense attorneys argued that someone with such exceptional psychological strength couldn't simultaneously be suffering from delusions, paranoia, or stress-induced mental breakdown. Morrison's second interview proved even more damaging to institutional interests. Under oath and with legal representation present, he provided detailed testimony that corroborated every element of Aria's account. His 20-year service record made him an unimpeachable witness whose testimony would be devastating in any court proceeding. Sergeant Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce had asked during formal deposition, "Are you certain of your observations regarding alleged coordination between Colonel Steele and his subordinates?" "Completely certain, sir." 6 officers surrounded Lieutenant Blackthorne in what was clearly a planned operation. When she reported explosive devices and requested proper EOD response, they attempted to physically subdue her. "Could you have misinterpreted rescue operations as aggressive action?" "No, sir. I've served under Colonel Steele for 8 years. I know the difference between rescue operations and coordinated assault." Pierce had pressed harder. "Sergeant, your career advancement depends significantly on recommendations from superior officers. Are you prepared to destroy those relationships based on split-second observations during a chaotic situation?" Morrison's response would be quoted in every subsequent legal filing. "Sir, my career advancement isn't worth covering up attempted murder of a fellow soldier. Some things matter more than personal benefit." The institutional response was swift and predictable. Morrison was reassigned to administrative duties pending investigation outcome, bureaucratic exile disguised as protective measure. His security clearance was suspended for review of reliability concerns. His family was informed that base housing might not be available, depending on investigation conclusions. Every pressure point was being squeezed to encourage cooperation with official narratives. But institutional pressure cuts both ways. The same system that could destroy individual careers could also protect them when properly leveraged. Major Walsh understood this dynamic and began applying counterpressure through proper legal channels. Her first move was requesting independent medical evaluation of Lieutenant Blackthorne by civilian psychiatric experts. The military's own evaluation process was compromised by chain-of-command conflicts that created inherent bias against honest assessment. Her second move was demanding expedited discovery of all evidence related to ammunition storage security, including access logs, maintenance records, and personnel assignments for the 6 weeks preceding the incident. Pattern evidence would prove systematic coordination rather than isolated incident. Her third move was filing formal protective custody requests for both Aria and Morrison, citing credible threats to witness safety based on institutional retaliation patterns. The legal machinery was finally grinding into motion, but slowly enough to allow time for political solutions to be negotiated behind closed doors. That evening, in the base commander's private conference room, a meeting convened that would determine whether justice or institutional protection would prevail. The participants understood that careers, reputations, and institutional credibility hung in the balance. The real battle was about to begin, fought not with weapons but with legal briefs, bureaucratic maneuvers, and political calculations that would determine whether one honest soldier's courage could overcome a system designed to protect itself at any cost. Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne's fight for survival had become a fight for the soul of military justice itself. The emergency meeting in Base Commander Colonel William Hayes's conference room assembled the power structure of Fort Ashworth like pieces on a chessboard. Each participant understood that the next few hours would determine whether the incident could be contained through institutional channels or would explode into public scandal requiring federal intervention. Colonel Hayes himself was a political survivor who'd navigated 3 decades of military bureaucracy without major controversy. His assignment to Fort Ashworth was meant to be a capstone posting before retirement, prestigious, low-risk, administratively focused. The events of the past 48 hours threatened to transform his final tour into career-ending catastrophe. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce sat to Hayes's right, legal files stacked with bureaucratic precision. His preliminary investigation had revealed a complex web of evidence that resisted simple explanation or easy dismissal. Physical proof of explosive devices, credible witness testimony, and documented patterns of harassment created legal problems that couldn't be solved through administrative sleight of hand. Major General Patricia Stone attended via secure video conference from Pentagon headquarters, her presence indicating that Fort Ashworth's problems had already reached the highest levels of military command. Stone's reputation for cold pragmatism made her the Army's preferred choice for managing politically sensitive situations that required decisive action over careful deliberation. "Gentlemen," General Stone began without preamble, I need clear assessment of our situation and recommended courses of action. Political implications are significant, media attention is building, and congressional oversight committees are asking pointed questions. Colonel Hayes cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, we have complex incident involving security breach, officer-involved shooting, and allegations of criminal conspiracy among senior personnel. Investigation is ongoing, but preliminary evidence is problematic. Define problematic. Physical evidence supports Lieutenant Blackthorne's allegations about explosive devices. Witness testimony from Sergeant Morrison corroborates her account of coordinated attack. Medical evidence confirms her injuries were consistent with assault rather than self-infliction. General Stone's expression remained neutral, but her fingers drummed against the conference table with increasing intensity. And Colonel Steele's response? He maintains that Lieutenant Blackthorne suffered psychological breakdown and misinterpreted rescue operations as hostile action. Claims explosive device was planted by Lieutenant Blackthorne herself as part of elaborate revenge fantasy. Evidence supporting his version? Pierce consulted his notes with obvious reluctance. Lieutenant Blackthorne's access codes were used to enter ammunition storage. Her psychological evaluations indicate stress reactions that could theoretically manifest as paranoid behavior. Her previous complaints about harassment established pattern of adversarial relationship with command structure. The silence stretched uncomfortably as General Stone processed the competing narratives. Both versions were internally consistent, both had supporting evidence, and both led to dramatically different conclusions about institutional responsibility. What about the other casualties? Major Cross and Captain Grimm were killed during the confrontation. Staff Sergeants Kane and Torres were seriously injured but stable. All four have exemplary service records and no history of misconduct. General Stone leaned back in her chair, calculating political equations that balanced individual justice against institutional protection. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity: sacrifice 6 careers to protect the system, or sacrifice 1 victim to maintain operational stability. Sergeant Morrison's testimony is the critical variable, she observed with clinical detachment. Without his corroboration, Lieutenant Blackthorne's allegations become unsupported claims from a traumatized officer. With his support, we have credible evidence of criminal conspiracy. Pierce nodded grimly. Morrison has been offered counseling, career assistance, and alternative assignment opportunities. He's declined all inducements to clarify his recollections. Meaning he's maintaining his testimony despite pressure to change it. Yes, ma'am. He's requested legal representation and protective custody. Claims his life is in danger from institutional retaliation. The political calculations were becoming clearer. Morrison's integrity made him dangerous to any cover-up operation but valuable to any legitimate investigation. His credibility as a 20-year veteran with unblemished service record gave weight to testimony that could destroy multiple careers simultaneously. Ma'am, Colonel Hayes interjected carefully, there may be alternative approaches that serve everyone's interests. Medical retirement for Lieutenant Blackthorne based on psychological unfitness. Administrative separation for Colonel Steele due to command failures. Quiet reassignments that remove problematic personalities without public controversy. General Stone's smile was winter cold. You're suggesting we sweep attempted murder under the bureaucratic carpet? Make criminal conspiracy disappear through personnel transfers? I'm suggesting we prioritize institutional stability over individual grievances. The greater good sometimes requires difficult compromises. Colonel Hayes, General Stone's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to ending careers with single sentences. The greater good is served by justice, not cover-ups. When institutions protect criminals, they become criminal institutions. The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, making clear that political solutions involving suppressed evidence and coerced testimony would not be tolerated at the highest levels of command. Pierce leaned forward with lawyerly caution. Ma'am, the evidence is complex and potentially contradictory. Rushing to judgment could result in wrongful convictions or institutional damage based on incomplete understanding. The evidence will be evaluated through proper legal channels with full transparency and media access, Stone replied firmly. Congressional oversight will be welcomed rather than feared. Inspector General investigation will proceed without interference or limitation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. No political protection, no bureaucratic maneuvering, no institutional cover-up. The case would proceed through normal legal channels regardless of embarrassment to Fort Ashworth or the broader military establishment. "Ma'am," Hayes asked quietly, "what about operational security? Base morale? Public confidence in military leadership? Will be preserved through demonstrating that the military justice system works correctly when crimes are committed. That institutions are stronger when they police themselves honestly rather than protecting corruption." General Stone's decision represented fundamental choice about military values: accountability over loyalty, truth over convenience, justice over institutional protection. It was the response Aria had hoped for but hadn't dared expect from a system that had already betrayed her trust. But institutional decisions made at general officer level still required implementation at local command level, where personal relationships and career considerations could undermine official policy. Colonel Hayes understood that his own career prospects depended significantly on how cleanly he could separate himself from the conspiracy while maintaining relationships with surviving personnel. His response would determine whether Stone's directive was followed faithfully or subtly sabotaged through bureaucratic resistance. "Ma'am, I'll implement full cooperation with investigative authorities and ensure complete transparency throughout the process," he announced with apparent conviction. "Fort Ashworth will demonstrate the highest standards of military justice." The meeting concluded with clear directives: criminal investigation would proceed without interference, witness protection would be provided for Morrison and Blackthorne, and media access would be managed through full disclosure rather than information suppression. As participants filed out of the conference room, each understood that the comfortable world of institutional protection and mutual loyalty had been replaced by harsh scrutiny where individual actions would be evaluated on their own merits. For Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne, isolated in her medical facility room, the decision represented vindication of her faith in military justice and validation of her courage in fighting institutional corruption. For Colonel Steele, confined to quarters pending formal charges, the decision represented the end of everything he'd built over 35 years of military service. For Sergeant Morrison, under protective custody in base guest quarters, the decision represented proof that honesty sometimes triumphed over expedience when good people refused to compromise their integrity. The battle lines were drawn, the rules of engagement established, and the real war for military justice was about to begin. Truth versus lies, evidence versus manipulation, courage versus corruption. And for the first time since discovering that booby-trapped ammunition bunker, Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne believed she might actually win. The formal court-martial proceedings began 6 weeks later in the sterile environment of Fort Ashworth's military courtroom, where justice would be measured not by institutional loyalty but by evidence, testimony, and legal precedent. The case had attracted national attention, transforming a local incident into a referendum on military culture, gender equality, and institutional accountability. Colonel Jackson Steele sat at the defendant's table flanked by two of the Army's most experienced defense attorneys, his uniform stripped of decorations but maintaining the bearing of someone who'd commanded respect for 3 decades. His legal team had crafted a defense built on questioning Aria's mental stability, challenging Morrison's testimony, and presenting alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne occupied the witness section in dress blues that highlighted her small stature while emphasizing her professional competence. 6 weeks of investigation had vindicated her allegations, corroborated her testimony, and established patterns of harassment that supported her version of events. But legal vindication required proving criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt to military jurors who understood loyalty's value in military culture. The prosecution team was led by Colonel Maria Santos, a career military lawyer with 15 years of court-martial experience and a reputation for aggressive pursuit of justice regardless of political considerations. Her opening statement established the framework for systematic conspiracy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case involves the attempted murder of a United States Army officer by 6 superior officers who viewed her competence as a threat to their authority." Defense counsel Major Robert Chin countered with psychological warfare disguised as legal argument. "The evidence will show that Lieutenant Blackthorne suffered acute psychological breakdown that manifested as paranoid delusions, self-destructive behavior, and ultimately violent assault on fellow soldiers attempting to provide assistance." The first witness was Sergeant Morrison, whose testimony would establish the foundation for either conspiracy or psychological breakdown. Under direct examination, he provided clear, detailed account of events that corroborated Aria's version completely. Sergeant Morrison, Colonel Santos asked, described Lieutenant Blackthorne's demeanor when she reported the explosive device. "Ma'am, she was calm, professional, focused. Exactly how I'd expect someone to behave when discovering a serious security threat. She followed proper protocols, attempted to request EOD support, documented everything with photographs." And Colonel Steele's response to her report? He and 5 other officers surrounded her in what was clearly a coordinated operation. When she attempted to report through proper channels, they prevented her communication and moved to physically restrain her. Under cross-examination, Major Chen attacked Morrison's credibility through subtle character assassination. "Sergeant Morrison, your career advancement has been minimal during 20 years of service. Do you harbor resentment against the command structure that limited your promotional opportunities?" "No, sir. I've been satisfied with my career progression and have no complaints against my superiors. Except for the 6 officers you're now testifying against in a capital case?" "Sir, I'm testifying about what I observed, not expressing personal resentment. What happened that day was wrong regardless of my feelings about anyone involved." The explosive ordnance disposal testimony was devastating to the defense. Technical evidence proved the device was sophisticated, professional, and designed to kill rather than merely intimidate. Component analysis revealed materials available only through military supply channels, requiring authorized access and technical expertise. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, Colonel Santos continued, "In your expert opinion, could this device have been constructed by someone without extensive explosive training?" "No, ma'am. The wiring, timing mechanism, and placement all indicate advanced technical knowledge and professional training. This was military-grade work by someone with years of experience." Could Lieutenant Blackthorne have constructed this device? Highly unlikely. Her training records show basic explosive familiarization but no advanced technical education. The sophistication level exceeds her documented capabilities. Defense attempts to suggest Aria had received secret training or accessed restricted materials collapsed under technical scrutiny. Her documented movements, access logs, and technical limitations made complex device construction impossible within available timeframes. Medical testimony proved equally damaging to defense theories. Independent psychiatric evaluation by civilian experts contradicted base psychiatrists' conclusions about psychological instability. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, Santos asked the renowned trauma specialist, "Did you find evidence of psychological breakdown or paranoid delusion in Lieutenant Blackthorne?" "None whatsoever." Her responses indicate exceptional psychological resilience, clear thinking under extreme pressure, and appropriate emotional processing of traumatic events. If anything, her psychological profile suggests someone unusually well-equipped for high-stress military operations. The defense's psychiatric evidence crumbled under professional scrutiny. Dr. Chen's evaluation was revealed to be superficial, biased, and inconsistent with established diagnostic criteria. Her conclusions reflected institutional pressure rather than clinical assessment. Physical evidence presentation was methodical and overwhelming. Photographs of the ammunition bunker breach, detailed analysis of the explosive device, documentation of systematic equipment failures affecting only Aria's operations, and timeline analysis proving coordinated harassment patterns. Colonel Santos introduced communications intercepts that proved devastating to Steele's defense. Radio conversations between conspirators had been recorded during normal base monitoring, revealing planning discussions and coordination of harassment activities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Santos addressed the jury during evidence presentation, "these intercepts prove beyond doubt that 6 officers coordinated systematic harassment designed to force Lieutenant Blackthorne's resignation or breakdown. When those methods failed, they escalated to attempted murder." The recorded conversations were damning in their casual discussion of criminal activity. References to "solving the Blackthorne problem," making her understand she doesn't belong, and "permanent solutions if necessary," eliminated any possibility of innocent misunderstanding. Defense attempts to challenge the intercept's authenticity failed under technical analysis. Chain of custody was perfect, authentication was conclusive, and content was consistent with other evidence patterns. Aria's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution case. Her calm, detailed account of systematic harassment, the ammunition bunker discovery, and the coordinated attack provided human context for technical evidence. Lieutenant Blackthorne, Colonel Santos asked gently, "Why did you continue serving at Fort Ashworth despite the harassment you experienced?" "Ma'am, I believed the military justice system would protect honest soldiers and punish criminal behavior. I thought competence and integrity mattered more than personal prejudice." "Do you still believe that?" Aria looked directly at the jury, her voice steady despite visible emotion. "Yes, ma'am. This court-martial proves the system works when good people refuse to compromise their principles." Cross-examination by Major Chen was aggressive but ultimately counterproductive. His attempts to portray Aria as unstable, vindictive, or unreliable were contradicted by her composed testimony and impressive service record. "Lieutenant Blackthorne," Chen pressed, "isn't it true that you harbored resentment against Colonel Steele from your first day at Fort Ashworth?" "No, sir. I respected Colonel Steele's rank and experience. My concern was with his unprofessional behavior toward female personnel." "Behavior you misinterpreted due to your own psychological issues?" "Sir, booby-trapping, ammunition storage, and coordinating physical assault aren't subject to misinterpretation. They're criminal acts regardless of the perpetrator's motivation." The defense case collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence, impeached witnesses, and technical impossibilities. Steele's testimony on his own behalf was catastrophic, revealing arrogance, prejudice, and contempt for accountability that alienated military jurors who valued honor above loyalty. Closing arguments crystallized 6 weeks of testimony into fundamental choice between justice and institutional protection. Colonel Santos delivered the prosecution's final appeal with controlled passion. Colonel Steele and his conspirators betrayed everything this uniform represents. They attacked a fellow soldier because she threatened their power, attempted murder because she discovered their crimes, and now ask for mercy they never showed their victim. Major Chen's closing was desperate appeal to institutional solidarity. Lieutenant Blackthorne's accusations destroy careers built over decades of faithful service. Good soldiers who serve their country with distinction deserve better than destruction based on misunderstood actions during crisis situation. The jury deliberated for 18 hours before returning with verdicts that would reshape military culture and establish precedent for holding senior officers accountable for criminal abuse of authority. Colonel Jackson Steele, guilty on all charges. Sentenced to 30 years confinement, dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances. The remaining conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, with dismissal and forfeiture for all. Their careers were ended, their reputations destroyed, their crimes exposed to public scrutiny. Lieutenant Aria Blackthorne stood as the verdicts were read, her father's memory vindicated and her faith in military justice restored. She had fought institutional corruption and won, proving that courage and integrity could triumph over power and prejudice when supported by evidence, law, and moral clarity. The system had protected truth instead of lies, justice instead of loyalty, victims instead of perpetrators. Sometimes, that was enough to change everything. 3 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Aria Blackthorne stood before a packed auditorium at the United States Military Academy at West Point, her promotion eagles gleaming under stage lights as she addressed the next generation of Army officers. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation. Her story had become legendary throughout military circles, a testament to courage under impossible circumstances and proof that institutional change was possible when individuals refused to accept corruption. "Cadets," she began, her voice carrying to the furthest rows without amplification, "you're about to receive commissions that will grant you authority over the lives and careers of American soldiers. How you exercise that authority will define not just your legacy, but the character of the institution you serve." The audience included senior faculty, visiting generals, and media representatives covering the Army's evolving approach to leadership education. Aria's presentation was part of a broader reform initiative launched after her court-martial testimony exposed systematic problems that extended far beyond Fort Ashworth. The congressional investigation that followed had revealed similar patterns at 17 other installations: harassment campaigns, equipment sabotage, and retaliation against personnel who reported misconduct. Her courage in fighting back had opened floodgates of testimony from soldiers who'd previously suffered in silence, creating momentum for fundamental reform. 3 years ago, Aria continued, 6 senior officers attempted to murder me because my competence threatened their worldview. They believed institutional loyalty mattered more than individual justice, that protecting careers was more important than protecting soldiers. She clicked to her first slide, a photograph of the booby-trapped ammunition bunker that had nearly cost her life. The image was stark, clinical, devastating in its implications about how far corruption could spread when left unchecked. They were wrong on every level. Institutions are only as strong as their commitment to justice. Loyalty that protects criminals isn't loyalty, it's complicity. And soldiers who stay silent about abuse become accomplices to that abuse. The reforms that emerged from her case had been comprehensive and permanent. New reporting mechanisms for harassment complaints, independent investigation procedures that bypassed compromised command structures, and zero-tolerance policies for retaliation against whistleblowers. The changes had been named the Blackthorne Protocols in recognition of her sacrifice and courage. Sergeant Morrison sat in the front row, now Sergeant Major Morrison, after promotions that recognized his integrity and moral courage. His decision to tell the truth despite enormous pressure had become a case study in military ethics courses, proof that individual conscience could overcome institutional pressure when properly supported. Sergeant Major Morrison chose truth over career advancement, Aria acknowledged, gesturing toward him. His testimony was critical to achieving justice, but more importantly, it demonstrated that honor isn't just a word in our creed, it's a daily choice between convenience and principle. Morrison's career had flourished after the court-martial. His integrity under pressure had marked him for advancement, leadership positions, and respect throughout the non-commissioned officer corps. His example proved that doing the right thing, while sometimes costly in the short term, created long-term rewards for individuals and institutions alike. The legal aftermath had extended far beyond individual prosecutions. Federal legislation strengthened whistleblower protections for military personnel, created independent oversight mechanisms for harassment complaints, and established mandatory reporting requirements for institutional retaliation. The military justice system itself had been reformed to prevent command influence over criminal investigations. Change didn't happen because I was exceptional, Aria emphasized to the cadets. Change happened because ordinary people made extraordinary choices when faced with moral tests. Each of you will face similar moments, situations where doing the right thing costs you personally but serves the greater good. Her own career had taken unexpected turns after Fort Ashworth. Promotion came rapidly, driven partly by recognition of her courage but mostly by demonstrated competence in increasingly responsible positions. She'd commanded military police units, served on reform implementation committees, and earned advanced degrees in military justice and organizational psychology. But the most meaningful changes were personal. The night terrors from the assassination attempt had faded with proper counseling and time. The hypervigilance that once made her suspicious of every colleague had been replaced by cautious optimism about institutional progress. The isolation she'd felt as the sole woman fighting corruption had been replaced by mentorship relationships with dozens of female officers who sought her guidance. The military is changing, she told the cadets with genuine conviction. Slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but consistently toward greater justice and accountability. You'll be part of that change, either by leading it or by resisting it. Choose leadership. The question and answer session revealed how thoroughly her story had penetrated military consciousness. Cadets asked about handling institutional pressure, recognizing harassment patterns, and maintaining moral courage when surrounded by competing loyalties. "Ma'am," asked a female cadet from the third row, "how do you overcome fear when facing powerful people who can destroy your career?" Aria considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Fear is appropriate when facing powerful enemies. It keeps you alert and careful. But fear becomes paralyzing when it prevents you from doing what you know is right. You overcome it by focusing on principles larger than personal consequences. A male cadet followed up, "What if the system doesn't support you? What if reporting wrongdoing just makes you a target for retaliation?" "The system has improved significantly since my case, but it's not perfect," Aria replied honestly. "Document everything, seek allies, use proper channels, and never fight alone if you can avoid it. But remember that sometimes individual courage is necessary to force institutional change." After the formal presentation, Aria was approached by dozens of cadets seeking personal guidance. Their questions revealed both hope and concern about entering an institution still grappling with cultural transformation. One conversation particularly stood out: a quiet cadet named Patricia Williams, whose father had been forced out of the Army after reporting sexual harassment by senior officers. The parallel to Aria's own father's influence was unmistakable. "Ma'am," Williams said hesitantly, "my dad always told me the military was different from civilian organizations, that honor and integrity mattered more than politics. But his experience suggests otherwise." Aria studied the young woman's face, recognizing the same idealism and determination she'd carried to Fort Ashworth years earlier. "Your father was right about what the military should be," she replied carefully. "My experience proved that making it what it should be requires constant vigilance and occasional courage." "Do you think it was worth it? Everything you went through?" The question went to the heart of everything: personal cost weighed against institutional benefit, individual sacrifice measured against collective progress. "Patricia," Aria said, using the cadet's first name deliberately, "6 men tried to kill me because they couldn't tolerate competent women in positions of authority. Today, women serve in every combat role, command at every level, and are protected by policies that didn't exist before our case." Was ending 6 careers worth saving countless others? Absolutely. That evening, Aria stood alone in the cemetery at West Point, visiting her father's grave for the first time since his funeral 13 years earlier. The headstone was simple: name, rank, dates of service, bronze star and Purple Heart symbols etched in granite. "Dad," she said quietly, "I kept the promise. I fought back when they tried to break me, stood up when staying down would have been easier, and changed things for the people who come after." A light snow was falling, dusting the headstone with white that reminded her of that terrible November day at Fort Ashworth when everything had almost ended in blood and betrayal. "The protocols you designed saved my life. The principles you taught gave me strength. The example you set showed me what honor really means." She paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm professional composure. "I hope I made you proud." The wind carried her words across rows of graves marking soldiers who'd served, sacrificed, and sometimes died for principles larger than themselves. Her father's legacy lived on through her service, but more importantly, through the institutional changes that would protect future generations of soldiers from the corruption that had nearly destroyed her. Walking back toward the academy buildings, Aria reflected on the journey from that morning at Fort Ashworth when she discovered the booby-trapped bunker. The terrified lieutenant who'd fought for her life in frozen North Dakota mud had become a senior officer responsible for training the next generation of military leaders. The transformation hadn't been easy. Years of therapy, careful career choices, and constant vigilance against cynicism had been necessary to maintain faith in institutional improvement. But seeing those eager cadets, knowing the reforms that now protected whistleblowers, watching women advance to positions once denied them, all of it validated the cost of fighting back when fighting seemed hopeless. Lieutenant Colonel Aria Blackthorne had learned the most important lesson of military service: sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating external enemies but forcing your own institution to live up to its highest ideals. Sometimes courage isn't charging enemy positions but standing up to friendly forces when they forget what they're supposed to represent. And sometimes the smallest person in the room carries the biggest truth, a truth powerful enough to change everything when combined with evidence, allies, and the unshakable belief that justice matters more than convenience. She'd tried not to cry, as her father had taught her. But when tears came, she'd wiped her eyes and gotten back to work, because that's what warriors do. They fight for principles worth defending, protect people who can't protect themselves, and never surrender to bullies regardless of rank, power, or institutional protection. The mission continued, because someone always had to stand on the wall. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.